South Africa's economy contracted the most in a century in 2020 as restrictions to curb the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic ravaged output and disrupted trade. Gross domestic product shrank about 7% compared to a 0.2% expansion in 2019, according to reports released by the Statistics South Africa Bureau on Tuesday from Pretoria in the capital. Over to Volvo. Volvo Cars set an ambitious goal to only sell battery cars by 2030, accelerating its plans after sales of electric vehicles surged. The Chinese-owned Swedish brand is rolling out a new lineup of electric cars and unveiled its second battery-only model, the C40 Recharge, on Tuesday. Going one step further than recent rivals' decisions on electric vehicles, Volvo electric vehicles will be available for sale only online, the company said in a statement. Very interesting. The CEO of Alpha Africa Advisory, Sanyade Okoli, joins us to discuss this further. Sanyade, very good to have you.
Thank
you. After our historic International Women's Day discussion
indeed.
On Monday. South Africa, let's start with that before we get to the matter of the Volvo and their electric cars. Why do you think this contraction was so pronounced in South Africa?
Okay, well, if we look at you think of the South African economy and how they had to handle the pandemic. They had one of the strictest lockdowns, certainly on the continent, and some would say, globally as well. And they've also suffered, very high numbers, about 1.5 million cases, close to about 500,000 deaths. Almost 50% of the deaths in Africa. So it's hit them quite badly. And then if you remember in December, they had this new strain which originated there, which again caused them, basically another big wave and having to tighten restrictions again. And if you remember, some of those restrictions included night curfew. So after everybody locked down, when they started easing, they still had to put bans on, they still had night curfews, they had to put bans on alcohol, etc. So that would not have helped, especially when they were already in a low growth situation.
Right. Speaking of low growth, does the added issues of South African Airlines and Eskom and the prior corruption in the Zuma administration, does that compound things further for South Africa?
Absolutely, because by the early part of last year, they were already in recession territories anyway. They haven't, in the last 5 or so years, at least 5 years, I know it goes back longer, they haven't enjoyed growth up to 2%. And even the forecast for 2020 pre-COVID was barely, shall we say, barely breaking even.
Right.
And there's some forecasts now that say that they might not actually go back to 2019 GDP numbers until 2024.
Gosh.
Which is actually quite a while. And it's because of the already long-standing issues of the electricity challenges, challenges with policy making, etc.
So as far as recovery is concerned, are those policy, infrastructure, do those have to quickly be turned around for South Africa to see brighter days?
Absolutely, but having said that, the Q4 2020 growth rates were actually a bit higher than what was expected. So on an annualized basis, it's about 6.3%, but a lot of analysts have been predicting something more like 5.5%. So definitely Q4, they did better than they expected, but it's just that the drop earlier in the year was so significant. And, there are quite a few factors globally, but, talking about it specifically in the South African case, if you think about it, the pandemic had an impact on production.
Yes.
It lowered household demand. You had the disruption to the supply chain and what they could do with their exports. And lastly, something which we really cannot underestimate is with the level of uncertainty we have, people hold back on investment.
Right.
And that too will have a trickle effect, yes.
Gosh. All right. Well, I want to switch to electric cars. I want to use South Africa because I remember Ford made an announcement that they were investing $1 billion in their South African plan to ramp up technology there. Yeah. Using that as a segue, Volvo and this plan to go all electric by 2030, does that sound overly ambitious to you? How do you
Well, it's difficult to say, but it's certainly ambitious. I think everybody recognizes it's ambitious. But having said that, it's not a plan without an underlying plan, so to speak.
Okay.
In that they've already, they're setting aside 5% of their revenue to go towards R&D. Okay. So they've, as far as they're concerned, they have a clear roadmap to achieve it. And it makes sense for some of these companies to actually set targets. And I'm sure you've seen over the last few weeks what's been happening to the stock prices of, car manufacturers that manufacture electric vehicles. And again, over the last few years, we've seen quite a significant uptick in the production and the sales of electric vehicles. So in about 2015, 2016, it was under 1 million cars. 2019, it was about 4.7 million cars. And we see that growing. It's gone from about 2018-19, where it was about 2% of total car sales. This year, it's expected to be something closer to 7% of car sales. So it is creeping.
It is.
And the more you have countries setting targets in terms of when they should stop selling new internal combustion engines, the more car manufacturers are going to switch their business model.
Fantastic. Now, I'm glad you mentioned those growing sales figures, because those are primarily happening in developed nations. So the adoption of these electric cars, and as they push towards these targets like Volvo, does that widen the gap between developed nations where their market is and developing nations where it's not? I mean, I know South Africa has some electric cars, but still, on the wider front, does it widen the gap?
Well, if we step back, part of the drive for electric cars is the impact on the environment.
Yes.
So in that regard, whilst we continue to use internal combustion engines, it means our emissions continue to be higher.
Correct.
But having said that, what's the cause and what's the effect? Because it's not the sale of electric cars per se that is widening the gap. It's the fact that we lack the supporting infrastructure to be able to support the use of these electric cars. So it goes back to dealing with the challenges with electricity and so on and so forth.
Fantastic. What about a minute to go? What does this mean for oil-producing nations like Nigeria and others, if all these guys are going,
Of course, it's a huge wake-up call. So if we take Nigeria, for example, our biggest customer for oil right now is India, and India has set some targets. So the world is changing. We see IOCs have been shifting, downsizing some of their fossil fuel departments and turning more of their attention towards green energy. The world is moving that way, and we need to begin to take the steps now to ensure that we don't get caught out. But the reality is, it's not going to be a drop-down effect. It's going to be a slow drift away from fossil fuels.
Are you optimistic that we can get there, though? Or is it going to take a while?
I think I'd like to say, what do we need to do to ensure we get there?
In order to get there. Fantastic. The CEO of Alpha African Advisory, Sanyade Okoli, thank you so much for joining us and giving us your insight.